Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, I'll give an overview of Gordon's theory of preparatory audiation. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. It's not an easy time to be a teacher, so I hope you're finding ways to take care of yourself, whether it's a bubble bath with a glass of wine or listening to music that feeds your soul. If you're struggling with making your MLT-based instruction work during the pandemic, the Gordon Institute for Music Learning has an event this weekend that you may want to take advantage of. This Sunday, October 18th, GIML will be hosting an online workshop called Multiple Modes of MLT, Navigating Music Learning Theory-Based Instruction in Light of COVID-19. This 3-hour event will feature 3 fantastic MLT educators, Jennifer Bailey, Kim Kane, and Amy Serziga. The event is free for GIML members and $20 for non-members. I'll put a link in the show notes to that event where you can register online. Also, don't forget that I'm currently holding 2 giveaways, one for a copy of Music Play and one for a copy of Music Play 2. These were generously provided by sponsor GIA Publications, publisher of many MLT-related materials. At the end of this episode, I'll give you a reminder of how you can enter both of those giveaways. Today's episode is the second in a short series centered around preparing students for formal music learning. In the previous episode, I talked about the differences between formal instruction and informal guidance in music, and why students need opportunities to engage with music through informal guidance before being expected to be successful with formal music instruction. We cannot immediately begin formal instruction through the scale learning sequence on day 1 with our students, and the main reason for this is that success with formal music instruction requires that students be audiating. So today we'll be looking at Gordon's theory of preparatory audiation, which attempts to explain the process through which we develop readiness for the types and stages of audiation. Just a quick note that if you haven't already listened to episode 1 on audiation, you may want to go back and give that a listen. So let's get into preparatory audiation. As I said in the previous episode, just as we do not come out of the womb thinking in language, we are not born audiating music, thinking in musical sounds, and processing musical syntax. We must be immersed in a rich environment of musical sounds in which others are interacting with us in order to learn to make sense of music. Before we develop audiation, we are in a phase Gordon refers to as preparatory audiation, or music babble. We experience preparatory audiation both tonally and rhythmically. During tonal preparatory audiation, young children absorb and respond to musical pitch, begin to develop a sense of tonal center, and discover and experiment with their singing voices. During rhythm preparatory audiation, young children absorb and respond to rhythm, begin to develop a sense of beat and meter, and experiment with moving and chanting rhythmically. One very important thing to keep in mind about preparatory audiation is that it is not dependent on chronological age. It is not only young children who may be in music babble. If you are a middle school or a high school music teacher, you probably have students in your classes who are still in music babble. They're still in that preparatory audiation phase. For example, I often teach a university class called Music for the Elementary Teacher. It's a class for general education majors, those who want to be grade level teachers, to learn how to incorporate music into their future classroom. And at the beginning of every semester, I'll sing a new song, but leave off the final resting tone. For those students who are already audiating tonally, they can hear that the song's not done yet, and they're annoyed that I haven't finished. But there are always other students in the class who have no idea that anything is amiss. They have no sense of annoyance at all that I haven't finished the song because they're still in tonal babble. So even though they're adults, they're still in preparatory audiation, and that's okay. We just need to acknowledge that they're not yet audiating and help get them there. So again, the speed at which individuals progress through tonal babble or rhythm babble is not dependent on chronological age. It's more dependent on prior experiences with music. To provide insight on music babble, Gordon developed his theoretical framework that outlines the stages of preparatory audiation, the phase that we're in before we move to audiation. This is divided into three main categories, which Gordon refers to as types of preparatory audiation. And each of these three types of preparatory audiation are divided into multiple stages. Now, before we get into these types and stages of preparatory audiation, it's important to acknowledge that they're not necessarily linear. They're more fluid and recursive. A child might go back and forth between two stages, and they're not at the same stage necessarily for both tonal preparatory audiation and rhythm preparatory audiation at the same time. Also, a child might be further along in the types and stages of preparatory audiation when it comes to more familiar tonalities and meters, but less further along with less familiar tonalities and meters. And this is why informal guidance experiences are important for all students, regardless of their chronological age. For example, even once your students are audiating in major, minor, duple, and triple, they still need informal guidance experiences in other tonalities and meters. Now, let's get into the three types of preparatory audiation, which are acculturation, imitation, and assimilation. The first type, acculturation, is exactly what it sounds like. When a child is in acculturation, they're beginning to become acculturated to the sounds of music in their environment. The first stage of acculturation is called absorption. And again, it's exactly what it sounds like. The child is hearing and absorbing the sounds of music in their environment. They're like a little sponge just soaking up all the musical sounds. That's absorption. Eventually, when they're developmentally ready, they move on to the next stage of acculturation, which is random response. In the random response stage, the child is responding to the music in the environment, but in a way that's not clearly related to the musical sounds. So a child in the random response stage may be moving and babbling, making sounds, but those movements and sounds don't appear to be directly related to the sounds and movements to which they're responding. Examples of behaviors you might see from a child in the random response stage could include changes in their breathing rate, facial expressions, vocalizations that aren't related to the musical sounds going on, or body movements that aren't related to the musical model. So, for example, if a child randomly wiggled their body in response to music or squealed during the silence after a song was finished, those would be examples of random responses. Eventually, the child moves to the purposeful response stage, and that is when they are trying to relate their movement and babble to the sounds of music in the environment. So in the purposeful response stage, the child begins responding to music in the environment in a way that is related to the sounds or the movement in the environment, though not necessarily in a conventionally correct way. Here's an example of purposeful response. This is audio of a purposeful response from an 8-month-old child in response to her mother's chanting. Clearly, you can hear that the child's sounds were related to the rhythmic chanting sounds that her mom was making. They didn't fit the same rhythmic context. They weren't what we would think of as conventionally correct rhythms because they didn't fit the rhythmic context. But there was clearly an attempt to make similar sounds, sounds that were related to her mom's sounds. Here's another example of purposeful response from my own daughter when she was around 4 months old. Again, you can hear how her vocalizations were clearly related to what I was doing, either in pitch level or in articulation in terms of the length or smoothness of the sounds. But the sounds she was making were not always conventionally correct, meaning they didn't conform necessarily to the tonal context in which I was singing. Quick side note, there are actually some folks who specialize in early childhood music through this preparatory audiation approach who would like to change the names random response and purposeful response to non-related response and related response, because we can't know the intent behind a child's behavior. We can't know what was random and what was purposeful. Changing the names of those stages to non-related and related responses would shift the focus instead to whether or not the behavior was related to the musical sounds in the environment. To recap, those are the 3 stages of acculturation: absorption, random response, and purposeful response. The next type of preparatory audiation is imitation. And according to Gordon, the first stage of imitation is an important one because it is when children start to make an initial transition from preparatory audiation and music babble to audiation. It's the beginning of that transition. When a child is in acculturation, they're not giving conscious thought to how they're responding to the music in the environment. But when they reach imitation, they do begin to give conscious thought to how they're responding to music in the environment. This begins with the first stage of imitation, called shedding egocentricity. Unlike the purposeful response stage, in which the child doesn't realize their musical responses are not accurate, a child who has reached the stage of shedding egocentricity starts to realize that their musical sounds and movement do not match those in their environment. They start to notice sameness and difference between what they're doing and what someone else is doing in terms of their musical sounds or their movement. So, in shedding egocentricity, the child begins to focus intently on their environment in an attempt to figure out how to match their sounds and movement to those in the environment. When the child does begin to imitate musical sounds with some degree of accuracy, they've moved to the stage of imitation called breaking the code. So again, the 2 stages of imitation are shedding egocentricity, when they start to realize sameness and difference, and the fact that their sounds are not necessarily matching the sounds in the environment, and breaking the code, where through focusing on the environment, the child begins to learn to imitate with some degree of accuracy. So finally, after focusing on the environment in imitation, a child returns to focusing on themselves when they reach the 3rd type of preparatory audiation, which is called assimilation. The first stage of assimilation is called introspection, and according to Gordon, this is the second of 2 important transition stages within preparatory audiation. Remember, the first of those 2 important transition stages was shedding egocentricity, the first stage of imitation, when the child realizes their sounds and movement do not match those in the environment, and they start to pay attention to the environment more. In the introspection stage of assimilation, the child realizes that their singing, chanting, breathing, and movement are not coordinated. So they return their focus from the environment, as in imitation, to the self in assimilation. Through returning focus to the self in assimilation, the child learns to coordinate their singing and chanting with their breathing and movement in the final stage, coordination, which coincides with increased accuracy. Once a child has a sense of tonal and rhythm syntax and can coordinate their singing and chanting with their breathing and movement with some precision, they can be considered to have moved from preparatory audiation into audiation and are ready for formal instruction. So to recap, the first type of preparatory audiation is acculturation, which includes absorption, random response, and purposeful response stages. The second type of preparatory audiation is imitation, which encompasses shedding egocentricity and breaking the code. Finally, the third type of preparatory audiation is assimilation, which includes the stages of introspection and coordination. By the way, if this theory of preparatory audiation is interesting to you, you might enjoy reading Gordon's book, Music Learning Theory for Newborn and Young Children. I'll link to that in the show notes. Also, I'll link in the show notes to the website of the Gordon Institute for Music Learning because they host courses where you can learn all about this theory of preparatory audiation and how it can apply to music learning settings. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about preparatory audiation is that everyone can progress through the types and stages of preparatory audiation and reach audiation. But it requires sufficient exposure to music and opportunities to interact with music with a live model. Unfortunately, it is also possible for a person to grow into adulthood without transitioning out of music babble, and this will hinder their ability to engage in and benefit from formal music instruction. So, before attempting to teach our students music through formal instruction, it is crucial that we provide them with opportunities to be immersed in a rich musical environment in which they experience extensive informal music guidance to help them progress through the stages of preparatory audiation into audiation. Now that we've looked at the types and stages of preparatory audiation, in the next episode, we will look at how we can use these ideas to inform what we do in our school music classes and how we can provide informal guidance experiences within the constraints of a school music class environment. Before I end today's episode, I wanted to remind you that we're currently running 2 fantastic giveaways from GIA. If you want to enter to win a copy of the original music play, just post a photo, image, or graphic on social media with the text, "I am a music teacher because," or "music is important because," and fill in the blank. Just be sure to add the hashtags Everyday Musicality Podcast and GIA Publications, and either set the post privacy to public so I can see it when I search for the hashtags, or tag the Everyday Musicality Podcast Facebook page, or email me a screenshot of your post. If you want to enter to win a copy of Music Play 2, you can head on over to your podcast app of choice, rate and review the show, and email a screen cap of your review to everydaymusicality@gmail.com, or post it to the Everyday Musicality podcast page on Facebook. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.